The effort to universalize blame, this issue of moral equivalence, the instinct to say, why do you condemn Russia but not Israel? It's superficially appealing but intellectually lazy. It collapses vital distinctions of context, intent, and action into a morally indistinguishable soup, and in doing so, it obscures both truth and justice. So let's begin with the false equivalence rightly raised by Brian Letter. There is a world of difference between criticizing a state's military policy and accusing it of genocide, and even more difference between opposing a government's policies and attributing collective guilt to its people, a practice which I think has chilling echoes of medieval anti-Semitic tropes and the modern ethno-nationalist simplifications that lead to war. So some of the comments are rightly pointed out to the danger of collective guilt and the obsession with conflating citizens with state policy, whether Russians with Putin's aggression or Israelis with Netanyahu's war, repeats the grotesque logic of the old anti-Semitic blood libel that one group must answer corporately for the sins of the few. This is the same thinking that permitted pogroms in Europe, apartheid in South Africa, or internment in the United States during World War II. It's the same thinking that would condemn all Gazans for Hamas or all Ukrainians for Azov. And yet, we must also guard against the opposite temptation, the moral deflection that insists no one is to blame, that all violence is equivalent, and that the only solution is silence or passive equivalence. And that isn't neutrality, it's abdication. No, it's the evidence of systemic war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine is overwhelming and grotesque. The actual evidence against the Ukrainian troops in Azov is far less certain. The bombing of maternity hospitals by Russia, certain. The abduction of children, certain. The silencing of anti-war voices by imprisonment or exile in Russia, certain. The atrocity of Bucha, certain. Kasparov, the chess player, gave a very interesting interview a while ago, and he said, we cannot keep calling it Putin's war when the war is executed by obedient state organs and cheered on by an imperial imagination that long predates him. But equally, we cannot really call it Russia's war. And in the same way, we cannot, Israeli policy under Netanyahu can and should be criticized, especially when it drifts into punitive mass suffering or disproportionate military response, without that criticism, I think, descending into anti-Semitism, delegitimizing the state of Israel, or an apologia for Hamas. And the distinction is always very difficult to make, but it is morally necessary. And this is where leadership fails us. Keir Starmer's hesitancy to draw a clear moral stance has left him, as I think he has been recently, advised to pursue the politics of triangulated football. Which team are you on? It's a failure of courage and a betrayal of nuance. As for to go back to the blood libel issue and the figure of Jesus, the historical figure, the myths of deicide and the misappropriation of religious identity in the service of violence, this distinction between Jesus, the teacher, and the Christ of doctrine, it was never the Jews who killed Jesus. It was a Roman execution. Crucifixion was a Roman execution. Stoning was the Jewish form of execution. Political brutality hiding behind theological scapegoating, a pattern that repeats and repeats and repeats when people try to universalize the horror that they witness. The Masada complex in Israel and the imperial trauma of Russia both illustrate how historical suffering, unresolved, becomes weaponized, not for defense, but for perpetuating that violence. To return then to the initial point, criticizing Israel's government is not anti-Semitism. Condemning Russia's the Russian people, or is wrong because they're not all to blame. But condemning the Russian state violence is not Russophobia. The refusal to see shades of grey, to distinguish between state and people, between necessary self-defense and the reckless escalation, between criticism and prejudice, is the beginning of propaganda, not politics. And I suppose this is a sort of clarion call for a politics of complexity, of courage and moral clarity. Maybe I'm calling in the wrong place. Maybe YouTube encourages people to see things in very clear distinctions. You're on this side, you're on that side. But we don't really have sides. That's the problem. Sides don't exist. What we have is nuance. And it's really important to try to clarify that. And yes, I suppose in lazy moments we talk about, we use the shorthand of Israel or Russia. But we should be careful to point out that the Israeli aggression is Netanyahu's aggression. The Russian aggression is Putin's aggression. And what we mean by that, of course, is the entire panoply of the state system managed by Putin, or managed by Netanyahu, or managed in his name or his name. That is what we're talking about. We're talking about the control of and the power of a state system that is harvesting its people for brutality, that is killing to justify an ideology and an obsession. Yes, the Hamas attack was grotesque and appalling, and demanded a response, but not the response that Netanyahu has produced, partly because Netanyahu's aims have not been achieved after 3 years. And as for Putin, there is nothing really that excuses the invasion. Nothing that excuses the invasion, and nothing that excuses the appropriation of Crimea, I'm afraid. There is no excuse. It's just fundamentally wrong.